The backstage hallway at the New Alexandria Ballroom smelled like cigarette smoke, spilled beer, and old wood. It was the kind of place where the walls had absorbed 30 years of music, swing bands, jazz quartets, rhythm and blues outfits that came through Memphis on their way to somewhere bigger. The carpet was dark red, worn thin in the center where stagehands and roadies had walked the same path 1,000 times. The lighting was a single row of bare bulbs running along the ceiling, casting everything in a flat yellow glow that made everyone look slightly ill. It was October 1967. Jerry Lee Lewis was standing near the back wall, one boot flat against the baseboard, a cigarette burning slow between two fingers. He'd been headlining shows like this since before half the audience was born. He knew exactly what the night looked like from where he stood. The nervous promoter with his clipboard, the local opening acts tuning up in the corner, the handful of journalists trying to look like they belonged. He knew the sound a crowd made when it was ready, and he knew the sound it made when it wasn't. He'd learned to read a room the way other men read weather. He was watching the young man across the hall. Jimi Hendrix was sitting on a road case, his Stratocaster resting across his knees, not plugged into anything. He wasn't playing. He was just holding it the way some people hold a cup of coffee. Not drinking, just keeping it close. His eyes were moving around the room slowly, taking things in without seeming to. He had on a shirt that looked like it had been cut from a curtain somewhere in Morocco. His hair rose in a wide shape above his head. He didn't look like a musician. He looked like something that had wandered in from a different dimension and hadn't yet decided whether to stay. Jerry Lee had heard the name. Hard not to. Hendrix this, Hendrix that. The British papers had been running out of words for the boy since the spring. He'd listened to about 45 seconds of "Are You Experienced" at a friend's place a few weeks back before deciding he'd heard enough. Loud, feedback, a lot of notes going nowhere in particular. Jerry Lee had been making rooms shake since 1956, and he hadn't needed to set anything on fire to do it. Not until he decided to anyway. He pushed off the wall and walked across the hall. "You're the guitar player," Jerry Lee said. Not a question. Jimmy looked up. "That's right. Jerry Lee Lewis. I know who you are." Jimmy shifted the guitar slightly on his knees. "Whole lot of shaking. Great balls of fire. Breathless." A small pause. "I've been listening to you since I was 12. Jerry Lee absorbed this without reacting. He'd been hearing versions of that sentence for over a decade. It never got old, but it also never meant much. Everyone said it, and half of them were lying. "Guitar," Jerry Lee said, nodding at the Stratocaster. He said the word the way a man might say hobby. Jimmy didn't respond. "You know what the problem with guitar is?" Jerry Lee took a drag of his cigarette, exhaled slowly toward the ceiling. "It tops out. There's a ceiling on it. You can play fast, you can play loud, you can bend strings all night long, but at a certain point you've said everything the instrument can say. Piano doesn't have a ceiling." He tapped ash onto the floor. "Piano is the instrument. Always will be." Jimmy looked at him for a moment. Then he looked back down at the guitar in his hands. He didn't say anything. Jerry Lee waited. Most people, when you said something like that to them, felt the need to defend themselves, to explain, to argue. The silence that came back from Jimi Hendrix was different. Not the silence of someone choosing their words, but the silence of someone who simply hadn't found the statement worth answering. Jerry Lee dropped the cigarette, stepped on it, and walked back toward his dressing room. The show was supposed to be two separate sets with a 30-minute break in between. Jerry Lee first, then the Jimi Hendrix Experience. The promoter had put it together that way intentionally. A passing of the torch was how he'd pitched it to the press. Old guard meeting new blood, rock and roll past and future sharing the same stage on the same night. The kind of bill that looked good in a headline. What the promoter hadn't fully accounted for was what it would feel like in practice. Jerry Lee took the stage at 9:15. The crowd was already packed tight up to the front barricade, and when he walked out and sat down at the upright piano that had been positioned at center stage, the applause was immediate and genuine. This was his room. He'd been in rooms like this 10,000 times, and he knew precisely how to own them. He opened with Mean Woman Blues, and the crowd was his by the end of the first chorus. What Jerry Lee Lewis did at a piano was not exactly music in the way critics like to describe music. It wasn't delicate. It wasn't nuanced. It didn't invite the word textured. It was something more like a force of nature that happened to be wearing a suit. His right hand hammered the high keys like it was trying to beat something into submission, while his left hand locked down the low end with a rhythmic authority that came from somewhere deep in the body's memory of things that predate civilization. He played standing, sitting, leaning sideways off the bench, with one hand still reaching back to keep the groove intact. He played with his elbow. He played the piano like the piano had done something to him personally, and he intended to get even. The crowd responded in kind. By the fifth song, people near the front were pressing forward hard enough that the security guards looked anxious. By the seventh, a woman in the third row had started crying, not from sadness, but from something that didn't have an easier name. The band behind him, bass, drums, played tight and clean, but nobody in the room was listening to them. Nobody was watching them. The room had contracted to one man and one instrument. Then Jerry Lee stopped. He stood up from the bench. He reached into the right side pocket of his jacket and produced a small metal flask. He opened it, took one measured sip, and looked at it for a second like he was considering something. Then he poured the rest of the lighter fluid out across the piano keys. The room went very quiet. He produced a match from his breast pocket, struck it against the side of the piano, and touched it to the keys. The piano caught fast, blue and orange, low at first, then climbing. The crowd made a sound that wasn't quite screaming and wasn't quite cheering. Something between the two, something involuntary. The light from the burning piano moved across the faces in the front rows, and every face looked the same, open, stunned, briefly and completely alive. Jerry Lee let it burn for a long moment. Then he turned and looked directly into the wings, stage right, where Jimi Hendrix was standing with his guitar already strapped on, watching. The two men looked at each other across 30 feet of smoky stage. "Beat that," Jerry Lee said. He didn't say it loudly. He said it the way a man says something he means. Then he walked off stage left, and the stagehands rushed on to manage the fire, and the crowd noise rose back up into something chaotic and delirious. And Jimi Hendrix stood in the wings for a moment longer, looking at the burning piano and the crowd beyond it, before he walked out. What happened in the next 45 minutes was something that people in that room would spend the rest of their lives trying to describe. Jimmy didn't open with something fast. He didn't match the energy Jerry Lee had left behind. The stagehands cleared the smoking piano, the smoke still hanging in the air like something wasn't finished yet, and Jimmy walked out into it with Mitch Mitchell and Noel Redding settling in behind him, and he started with a single, clean, sustained note that hung in the room like a question. Then he started to answer it. Jerry Lee was watching from the side of the stage, still in his suit jacket, arms crossed. He'd intended to watch one song, maybe two, and then go back to his dressing room and start the slow process of coming down from a show the way he always did. Whiskey and quiet, and letting the adrenaline drain out on its own schedule. He told himself he was watching out of professional courtesy. He told himself it was something like that. He didn't move. What Jimi Hendrix did with a guitar was not the thing Jerry Lee had dismissed on that record. It was related to that thing, but it was not that thing. In the way that a photograph of a fire is related to an actual fire, but will not warm you and will not burn your house down. Live in a room with the volume hitting you in the chest and the lights moving and Jimmy's body moving, with the music like the music was coming through him rather than from him. It was something that did not have a clean category. He played the guitar the way Jerry Lee played piano, like the instrument was the only thing standing between him and something enormous. And the only way through was to play harder and deeper and more honestly than he had ever played before. He made the Stratocaster say things that guitar was not supposed to be able to say. He made it cry. He made it sound like something that hadn't been invented yet. He played with the feedback the way a sculptor plays with clay, shaping it, bending it into forms that had structure and intention. He played a passage so fast it blurred into texture, then let it fall back into a single bent note that lasted nearly 8 seconds, vibrating and shifting in pitch with tiny movements of his finger. And the room was so quiet during that note that you could hear the sound of people holding their breath. Jerry Lee's arms unfolded somewhere around the second song. He didn't notice. By the third song, he'd moved 2 steps closer to the stage entrance without realizing it. By the fourth, he was standing at the very edge of the wing, one hand on the wall, watching the way a man watches something he is trying to memorize. The burning piano had been a declaration. What Jimi Hendrix was doing was something older and harder to argue with than a declaration. He wasn't competing. He wasn't answering. He was simply playing. And the playing was saying everything that needed to be said about what music was and what music could do and why anyone ever picked up an instrument in the first place. When the set ended, the crowd noise lasted a long time. Jerry Lee walked back to his dressing room. He sat down in the wooden chair in front of the mirror and looked at himself for a while. The man looking back at him was still the man who had set a piano on fire 40 minutes ago. That had still happened. That was still real. He had still walked out in front of 2,000 people and burned the furniture and told rock and roll that this was what it looked like. This was what it cost. This was the only standard that mattered. And then Jimi Hendrix had walked out after him. Jerry Lee picked up his jacket from the arm of the chair. He turned it over in his hands once, slowly, then he put it down. He sat there for a long time without moving. He didn't talk about that night for years. Not specifically, not by name. When interviewers asked him about Jimi Hendrix, he said what people in his position usually said. Acknowledged the talent, kept it brief, moved on. He was Jerry Lee Lewis. He didn't make a habit of explaining himself or accounting for the things he'd felt in private. But in an interview published in 1987, 20 years later, which is a long time to carry something, a journalist asked him a simple question. Was there any guitarist who ever surprised you? Jerry Lee was quiet for longer than was comfortable. One, he finally said. The journalist waited. I told him guitar had a ceiling. Jerry Lee looked somewhere past the journalist's shoulder. I told him piano was the instrument, always would be. He paused again. Then he played. He didn't finish the sentence. The journalist didn't push. Some statements finish themselves. Piano is the instrument. Until the night you stand in the wings at a ballroom in Memphis and watch a man with a Stratocaster say something through 6 strings that you have never been able to say with 88 keys, and you understand, not angrily, not with any particular drama, just quietly and completely, that the instrument was never the point. The music was always the point. Jerry Lee Lewis knew that. He'd always known it. He just needed one night in October 1967 to remember.